You are watching Xirtus.
And a lot of people say, oh, but then Trump maybe has, bribed his way through the conclave. And I think we are totally the other way, the opposite way. I mean, Trump would have probably done much better with some other candidates, as this one is blatantly anti-Trump, and he has been tweeting, like the New York Post said, retweeting for years anti-Trump stuff from the very early stages of Trump's primaries in the first election till now. So he's been really very critical of Trump, of his immigration policies, but also about many other issues that regard Donald J. Trump. So of course, the left is all happy, and they are like chanting, oh, wow, we have finally a great successor for Pope Francis, and he's even an American. Oh, this is great. And of course, then, you have them saying, oh, well, MAGA is furious, is getting upset because of the anti-Trump views that were expressed by this Pope when he was still a cardinal, or even earlier when he was a bishop. We can say that these anti-Trump views are pretty evident. I mean, he's very much a Marxist. The USA Today entitled an article this morning, is Pope Leo XIV a woke Marxist Pope? And then the answer was, he is, if you are a Trump supporter.
Right, yeah, because it seems like he's being presented on one hand as a Republican and a mathematician, and on the other hand, they're not really holding accountable that he's been very open borders. He's all about open borders, and he's anti-immigration.
This guy has been promoting articles critical of J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. Like I said, he has expressed sympathy for George Floyd. He has nothing that really we can say in any way is positive for Trump or his administration. However, Trump, of course, had to be very diplomatic. It's like you need to understand that he's also a head of state. It's not only the head of a religion. And he might be a woke pope, but he is still an American, though he has dual citizenship with Peru, but he's still an American. So as an American, if you have the first pope made in the Vatican, you have to pretend at least diplomatically to, in fact, the words of Trump were quite encouraging in that sense. Now, this morning there was the American Cardinal Conference for the journalists, the press conference for the journalists. So I followed the whole thing from Rome. In the audience, there were the usual people like Lester Holt and all those mainstream guys. And so I followed the whole thing. And of course, we are talking about the first American Pope, but we're also talking about somebody who has grown within the missions abroad, especially in South America, and especially in particular in Peru, like I said. And he has been very much pro-immigration, open borders, very much also in defense of the Venezuelans. And we know that the Venezuelan immigration, unfortunately, also has been a problem with all those gang members and so on. So it is a little bit, to say the least, controversial, the fact that this is an American Pope, because it is almost like the choice was made to wage a daily psyop war upon Americans and upon the Trump administration.
Right. And it's also interesting because of, the Pizzagate aspect to this, just that, the Catholic Church and any sort of human trafficking and treatment of children by pedophiles, he's been protecting them, arguably.
That this guy has been covering up for acts of pedophilia.
Yeah.
You see, when he was, for example, also involved with the Augustinian order in Chicago, he apparently covered up for a case there, but apparently there is also other cases that he covered later on. So
even more recently in Peru. So it seems like he gets in trouble for covering up in America. He has to go to live in Peru because that's what they do. They move you around, right? If you're doing this, they hide you in some other place, some other town, eventually some other country. But now there's cases in Peru. So he's everywhere he goes, even into 2024, there are cases of him hiding it, which is pretty crazy.
He has been accused definitely and quite openly of being one of those candidates to the papacy that had the past that could come back to haunt him. Now, in regards to the way this conclave was going, in the end, like I said, he was chosen because, of course, the Jesuit had these candidates that they had their own approval, and amongst them there was, of course, this guy who out of nowhere was brought to Rome, was made cardinal, eventually this year was even given the seat of cardinal bishop, which means, you know, like when you are a general, you have various stars, no? And this is like the ultimate cardinal when you have also that kind of recognition for Pope Francis, who has prepared the way for him to arrive to become the Pope. It's quite clear from a study of his career that is not simply a guy that comes out of nowhere like they claim. He had the support of Pope Francis all the way, and he had the support of the Jesuits, who started to talk about him in very, you know, promising terms in publications like America, the Jesuit Review, which I talk about in my book, is a very important publication for, you know, presenting people within the Vatican hierarchy, but also for presenting political figures like, for example, Alexander Ocasio-Cortez, which had her bio appearing on America Jesuit Review in 2018 when she kind of came out of nowhere. So somebody said the wrong Leo is the Pope.
That's exactly right. Yeah. That's what I was thinking.
Now let's go back to that. I mean, in my book, I explained that Pope 13 was definitely a very different character from because at the time when I finished writing this book and the day the Pope died. And so this book is, of course, a book that explains how the Vatican has been hijacked by the Jesuits and that there was no possibility that we were turning back to the days of pre-Vatican II, like some people were hoping. And I think that also, I mean, it must have been a disappointment for a lot of conservative, traditional Catholics who still think the Latin Mass is the solution to all the problems. And I agree, it's a great thing. But it's not, unfortunately, something that is going to gather momentum in a Catholic Church that's been hijacked a long time ago by these forces which are now unified, and it's progressive Freemasonry and Jesuitism that work hand in hand to bring in gradually this one world religion. So this Pope in particular comes in, and he comes in with an experience, of course, which for them is very important, the experience in South America, because when you're talking about South America, you're talking about also the famous or infamous, depending on the points of view, Pact of the Catacombs, which was something I discussed very much in volume 7 of my Confessions. And this Pact of the Catacombs is an agreement that was signed by 42 bishops of the Catholic Church in the catacombs of Domitilla near Rome in November 1965. We were 3 weeks before the closing of the Second Vatican Council. So we were right at the end of the Vatican Council, and the people who became involved with this pact, which was almost a Marxist takeover of the church, headed by a guy called Elder Camara, who will become then the mentor of Klaus Schwab, who founded, of course, the Davos World Economic Forum, and invited him, in fact, in one of his first events to hold a speech. He is known as the Red Bishop. He was known, because he died in 1999, as the Red Bishop, and he was very much a self-identified socialist, an advocate of liberation theology. So all these people who met in secret in this Pact of the Catacombs were from South America, and they were pushing, this liberation theology. And there was, of course, a variety of bishops from Brazil, from Panama, there was also a North American bishop, by the way, I think from Quebec, so from Canada, but Canada is pretty left. It's pretty on the left.
Right.
And so there was various people associated with the liberation theology, and the document that was produced in these catacombs and was never mentioned publicly at the time, resurfaced later on during the papacy of Pope Francis, because these people were very influential in the life and in the work of Pope Francis. You see, like I explained in my book, after the Second Vatican Council, it wasn't that suddenly the church switched modality and turned to Marxism and to a mix of communism and Catholicism, which is the case now. There were initially those conservative forces. We have talked many times, for example, about the P2 Lodge. Now, in this book, I explain also with the testimony of the late Alicia Gelli, the worship master of the P2, how Argentina was a key place, like other places in South America, of course, connected to the Operation Condor and all the rest, but it was connected to the branching out of the P2 Lodge in South America. And Jorge Mario Bergoglio would be eventually initiated in Freemasonry, and that led to him arguing with the Jesuit, the superior general of the time, Padre Arupe, who was a Marxist, who didn't like really the P2 and the dictatorships that led in Argentina in particular to the dirty war, the desaparecidos and all that. So Jorge Mario Bergoglio, for a moment, sided more with Freemasonry and the conservative side of Freemasonry, and was helped by them to establish himself later in the early 90s as a bishop, eventually becoming the Bishop of Buenos Aires. But then there was a moment in which he got back into the fold with the Jesuits, and that was, like I explained in my book, when he refused the offer of Ratzinger to become the commissioner of the Jesuits, because both John Paul II as well as Joseph Ratzinger were conservative and understood the danger that the Jesuits posed.
Liberation theology, right?
But not only that, the Jesuits in general had all these crazy ideas, which are now the ideas of the left, the climate change, everything that this new Pope is pushing forward is part of the Jesuit ideology.
Sometimes I look at the moon and just think, the skin's beautiful. Baby, when I met you, there was peace unknown.
We should talk, Harry. Purpose said it's in it again.